Hi, this is Brass and we're recording this on Monday, April 4th, 2022, and we're responding to a article by Neil Howe. A lot of people write to me about Neil Howe and his great fourth turning theory of generational change. Different generations have different qualities and they have a different impact on society, and there seems to be a predictable cycle of those changes, and he calls them turnings, and we're heading to the fourth turning. And this is not a new idea. He's just simply put it in a new language, but that's legit. Making something that's interesting and worth considering, easy to understand and think about is a good service. What is not a good service is his aggressive, energetic promotion of the COVID hysteria and the COVID bullshit. I mean, he is a card-carrying, either true believer, delusional person, or somehow he's part of the cabal that thinks we all need to be scared into some kind of submission on behalf of the authorities. I don't get this guy. He's seemingly intelligent, but he is clearly heavily ideological. And at this late date, April 4th, 2022, Neil, it's time to wake up. So here's his latest, and it's pretty disturbing, and it's a good hint of what we can expect in the months and years to come. A new study estimates that worldwide death toll from COVID-19 may be 3 times greater than the count, according to official data. In all, researchers say that 18.2 million people died have thus far. Now, this has come from The Lancet, which has tragically also become a politicized ideological rag. Now, where is this brilliant data coming from? Oh, Bill Gates' University of Washington. I mean, really, Neil? Yet after 2 years of watching this, you haven't made the connection between institutions that Gates has given millions of dollars to and their leadership in cooking up dodgy data? I mean, I think you're an intelligent man, but boy, how are you missing this? I mean, you've got to be working hard to miss this. And Neil, in case during all this intensive research you've been doing over the years into societal trends, you missed this, this data comes from the Washington University Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which received a 10-year, $279 million investment by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. $279 million. That buys a lot of bullshit. And while we're on it, Neil, and I guess this is becoming about you, because you need to get a grip. The other phenomenal lying fest that took place on the statistical projection level was by the great Neil Ferguson, who is a employee of Imperial College London. And wouldn't you know that Bill Gates happened to have written a massive check to the Imperial College of London too. And then there's the other once respected organization, Johns Hopkins, still has some legitimate people on its staff, but pretty much has been completely bought by, you guessed it, Bill Gates, also Bloomberg, who also seems to feel that we all need to be put in line, and the only way to do it is with official lying and hysteria, which again, Neil Howe seems to be on board with and working hard at. So the source of the data is crap, but let's now go to the conclusion. And let me read it for you. Between 2020 and 2021, there were 18.2 million global excess deaths. That's 12.3 million more deaths than the official COVID death count. Or in other words, it's 3.1 times higher. In absolute numbers, 7 countries had excess deaths above 500,000. That would be India with 4 million, the US was 1.3 million, Russia with 1.1 million, Mexico 798,000, Brazil 792,000, Indonesia 736,000, Pakistan 664,000. First of all, just off the top, these are countries with massive populations. Every one of them listed here. India's got 1.38 billion people. Indonesia, many people are not aware, has over 250 million people. So these numbers have to be put in context. They have to be relative to the overall size of the population to have any meaning at all. But there's something more here. Simply based on these purported excess deaths, and again, anything that comes out of the Lancet at this point, anything that comes out of a Bill Gates funded institution, and I'm sorry to say anything that comes out of Neil Howe's word processor needs to be tested, double tested, and triple tested. But when you read this thing, yeah, maybe there were excess deaths, and they are attributing them to COVID based on nothing. Well, COVID occurred during this period. We had this many excess deaths. Therefore, the deaths must be the result of COVID, the disease. Do you need to be over 5 years old to see that this is a logical fallacy? Isn't it every bit more likely that the societal lockdowns, that the closing of schools, that the closing of churches, the closing of businesses, the breakdown of the supply chain, the chaos that was permitted to take place in the medical arena, the disastrous so-called medical treatments that were given to people, throwing people on vents that should never have been put on mechanical ventilators, remdesivir, right? The AZT of the 2020s. How many people did that kill? How many people died who had a modest disease that turned into a raging one because they were afraid to go to the hospital? And then when they got there, there was no cure. There was no treatment. That's just the COVID deaths. But remember, a lot of people died from suicide, right? Suicide attempts by teenage girls up 51%, Neil Howe. Does that not resonate with you at all, that maybe there was a societal problem that had nothing to do with the virus? Deaths by alcoholism up 25%. Deaths by overdose, I don't know what the number is offhand in the United States, but up significantly. The World Bank, and this is a statistic Neil Howe seems to have no interest in at all, estimated at the beginning of this that over 120 million people were going to be put into extreme poverty by the economic dislocations of the government response to the media-driven anti-scientific fraud promoted by people like Neil Howe. 120 million. Now, some people know what extreme poverty means, some people don't. I'm going to confess, I didn't know till I went to Guatemala into the backcountry. You don't know poverty until you've seen what extreme poverty is. It is no access to safe potable water. It is living on a handful of carbohydrates a day. It is working like a slave just to get that. No access to medical care, little education. To call the housing substandard wouldn't even be fair because it's so far beyond what substandard means that it doesn't even compute. So when you push 120, and no sanitation, I mean, just, it's worse than, you got to see it to believe it. When I first saw it, I was crushed. I mean, you hear about poverty and you're aware of it, and maybe you've gone long periods of your life where you had to miss, a lot of meals and barely pay your rent, but you don't know what poverty is till you've seen poverty in the developed world. And I'm sure there's examples of it in this country too, but it's much more prevalent overseas. So when you now that was the estimate in 2020, who knows how many people were really put into extreme poverty? That number, nobody's interested anymore. Neil Howe's not interested. Bill Gates is not interested. University of Washington is not interested. Imperial College of London is not interested. The New York Times is not interested. But that's an important number, because take this on faith. If you put somebody in extreme poverty, you have shortened their life dramatically. If they have any health vulnerabilities at all, you've killed them. You've killed them. So if let's take the World Bank's estimate of 100 million people put in extreme poverty, it's entirely likely that 5% of them are already dead, which would give us 5 million excess deaths just on the extreme poverty front. And that's assuming that many, many more people were not put into extreme poverty. And then there's the phenomenon of how much it hurts to drop down an economic level. So you might have had, for every one person that was put into extreme poverty by the government, media, pharma, Bill Gates, Neil Howe, hysteria, you might have had 10 times that many people who were pushed out of the middle class. They'd spent a generation or two getting some leg up in this world, and along comes the scamdemic, and now they are poor again. And that drop in economic status can cause a lot of despair. And I'm going to guess that happened to hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And not everybody got the free checks from Uncle Joe Biden and Trump. No, most parts of the world, you don't work, you don't eat. And by the way, another thing we all should be aware of in the developed world. Here's how it works in the developed world. In the undeveloped world, you work your ass off all day. And maybe, if you're lucky, you've earned enough to feed your family that day. And then tomorrow is a new day, and you got to start all over. Right? So imagine how precarious that is. I'll give you an example. I'm kind of plugged into a village in the well, I know the Philippines too. Dad lost his job, right? In this family. He was a major breadwinner. There were only 2 breadwinners in the family, and one of them lost his job entirely. No welfare check. Right? So that's a little microcosm, right? In Guatemala, there's a village that I'm really connected with, and the men are day laborers, they're construction guys, and the women are seamstresses, and they make things for the tourists and so on. Well, the tourist market died; it was gone. So and when I think of Guatemala, I mean, there must have been hundreds of thousands of people who were already living on the edge of extreme poverty, who lost their income. And I guarantee the government of Guatemala did not bail them out. And the men were not allowed to leave their village. They put a corridor, I'm sure Neil Howe would approve, around the village, just like the Nazis did when they went into Eastern Europe. Not everybody was sent to a camp. Sometimes they just locked up a village and turned the village into a concentration camp. So these men were not allowed to leave their village to go where the work is. So you had people that were busting their asses just to survive by a thread, suddenly deprived of their income for months and months and months. That's where the excess deaths came from. Didn't come from the virus. So we're going to hear more of this. And by the way, this is an echo of the great influenza of 1918 bullshit. Okay, that thing happened during World War I. We've talked about this before. It's worth repeating. It was a war. Food shortages were so severe during World War I in Europe that there were over 300 major reported food riots in Germany. Right? So those are the major ones, and those are the ones that got reported. And so there were probably, 10 times as many food riots. A food riot. Have you ever seen a food riot in your life? That's something you see in Biafra or something, or in Bangladesh, and you don't even see that. You see it during a period of people being very, very desperate. Germany had over 300 food riots. That's how hungry they were. All right, so you subject people to the stress of war. You subject people to the stress of dislocation. You subject people to the stress of being chronically hungry for months and months on end. Then in this country, and I'm sure it was true in all the countries involved in this war, they pulled all the competent doctors and nurses out of the civilian hospitals and sent them to the war effort. That's history, folks. You can look it up and read it. So hospitals, which are usually a train wreck on the best of days, had all their strong hands removed, and the weak hands were running things. Wow. You think maybe that might have caused an epidemic of all kinds of diseases? And by the way, no autopsies were done. Very little scientific testing was done. What people were dying of during this period is up for grabs. But the narrative was created that it was the Great Flu. Now, it gets even more sinister. In the early 1920s, somebody said, I wonder how many people died, and did a study. An imperfect study because the data was imperfect and because the autopsies and the scientific investigations were not done at the time when they need to be done. It will always be imperfect. So he came up with a back of envelope estimate of 20 million people. That was in the 1920s. Settled, done, nobody else is going to talk about it. Then along comes the 1980s when, I don't know if Fauci was particularly involved in this, but when NIH changed its tune. And suddenly there's a cottage industry of writing about the great flu epidemic of 1918 after a 60-year lapse. And using the same crap data that they had in the 1920s, they upgraded the number of deaths to 50 million. Based on what, I ask? And I'll answer, based on nothing. Now, it's typical for civilian writers, for non-specialist writers, i.e. people writing out their ass, to say, well, the number was really probably 100 million, experts estimate. And I defy anybody to find where that 100 million number death is coming from. So we have inflation of death to count. We had a guess. I'm going to guess it was an honest guess. They had no reason to make things up back in the early 1920s. And then in the 1980s, suddenly a revived interest in the death count, and it became... And there's hundreds of books, I mean, not hundreds, but I would say dozens of books about the great influenza, and they're all singing the same tune. It's 50 million, but probably really 100 million. So we're going to have the same thing with COVID. Oh, and we, we know from the Italian data, and we knew this in 2020, that for every death they attributed to COVID, I think it was 5%, 10% or less of them actually was from COVID. The rest of them were people that already had cancer, already had diabetes, were already 95 years old and had dementia, and they happened to die with a positive COVID test. So the real numbers is whatever they say people who died of COVID, it's 10% of that probably, based on real data by a real group that's not getting a paycheck from Bill Gates. So when they say 1 million people, I don't know what they're saying in the States. I don't even pay attention anymore. It's ludicrous. But if they say 2 million people died in the United States over the last 2 years from COVID, it's actually possibly 200,000, which is 100,000 a year, which might be high for a flu, for a coronavirus. But in any event, this is what's going to happen with COVID-19, and Neil Howe and people like him are going to lead the parade. Well, whatever the inflated number is, it's really 2 times that. It's probably 3 times that. I don't know why they stop at that. Why don't they just go to 10 times? Why don't they just go to 100 times? Why don't they just say that the entire planet Earth died from COVID, and we're all just dreaming that we're alive? I mean, that's the next logical conclusion of this. In any event, I know people are big fans of Neil Howe and the fourth turning. Number one, that idea is not original. It's just an original statement, which, again, as I said at the beginning, is legit. But his being a band leader, a cheerleader for the COVID con frauds, and I'm not saying people don't die of respiratory diseases, not saying that at all. But I'm saying, as we've been saying since February of 2020 when I saw the reports out of Wuhan. By the way, can Neil Howe, the great demographer, explain this? Supposedly 1 million plus people have died of COVID in the United States. China says only 5,000 people have died from it. How does that work? How does a country that's 4 times the size of the United States have an infinitesimal number of deaths versus us? Somebody's lying. And I have a feeling it's everybody in this particular game. So anyway, that's my rant for today. You're going to hear a lot of these reports that, oh, we really underestimated this. It was so much worse than you realize, folks. That's why we destroyed your business. That's why we destroyed your child's development. That's why we interrupted the important education and socialization of young people. That's why we separated people from their religious institutions. That's why millions of people, elderly people all over, and sick people all over the world died alone, separated from their loved ones. That's why we have an economic train wreck that we're going to be digging out of for the next decade. That's why all these catastrophes happen, folks, because this was way worse than you know. That's where they're going with this, and I'm sure you're not going to be fooled. Anyway, thank you for everybody that supports Brass Check. This is free to you, not free to us. We got the server bill, the email bill, the tech helper bill. I even pay a research assistant from time to time to help me out. And it would be great if I were not paying all these bills out of my pocket. Luckily, I'm not, thanks to supporters, but we can always use more support because I'd love to be able to hire more help. If you think you're getting this kind of news and analysis anywhere else, there are some sources actually out there. There are not many. We all need help because we definitely aren't getting any help from anybody. We get our social media channels canceled, we get our servers attacked, we get our email not delivered, you name it. And that's just on the delivery end, right? That's just on the delivery end. We have our videos erased from YouTube, and some of us are personally disparaged widely by major news media outlets. Other than that, it's a great life, but wouldn't be doing anything else. But you can be part of it by supporting us financially. Every little bit counts. It's all appreciated. And to those who do support this effort, thank you. Can do it without you. Really appreciate it. And everybody that's getting this should appreciate you too.